what that would look like if that were passed into law for Michigan. And I'm just going to flag it from the top. I've smushed together 3 different presentations for our presentation tonight. So there's a lot of material in here, and I'm going to move through quite a bit of it quickly, but it's all important just to sort of set the landscape. And then, as Tom said, we've got Q&A at the end, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone afterwards if we don't have time to get into some of the specifics of the things. I'm going to move through pretty quickly before I get to SB 275 and sort of how that would look. So at a very high level, and I'm sorry if this is review entirely, what is biogas? What are we talking about? So biogas consists of methane, carbon dioxide, and other trace gases. You can produce biogas from just about any organic material, usually a waste stream. And by organic, I just mean with carbon in it. So food scraps, almost anything you can think of that would decompose as compost would decompose. And that biogas can be used in different ways, either in that form or what is very often done for programs like what we're discussing today for these transportation programs is the biogas is refined into what the industry calls biomethane. And that can be transported in natural gas pipelines, and it can be burned alongside fossil natural gas in all the same ways that we use it today. Okay, so why factory farm gas? We use that term because it describes the type of quote unquote feedstock that's used to produce this gas. So as I said before, you can produce biogas from a whole bunch of different sources. It has been produced at, for example, wastewater treatment plants. So like a municipality's water treatment plant for a long time to collect the sludge that's produced in that process and produce biogas. What we're seeing today is very new and is really I would call it an entirely new nascent industry. So while the technology of how to produce biogas from animal manure is not itself necessarily that new, the types of projects, the types of investments, and sort of the industry structure that we now see is quite new and raises some really significant concerns. So factory farm gas, because you're producing the gas essentially from animal manure. But for those of you that are familiar with how factory farms operate, you have processed wastewater as well. So milking parlor waste. The poultry industry really wants to get into this industry, so they have a variety of waste streams. And I should note that one of the things that really seems to be the evolution of this industry is one of 2 models. The first is called community digesters. So what you see on the screen in front of you here to the left is what's called a covered lagoon digester. So it's sort of your standard rudimentary pit in the ground, and then they put a tarp on top of it, and that sort of collects the gases as they come off the lagoon, and then that's sent off for processing or whatever it's going to be used for. One of the models we're seeing today are these community digesters. So they're much larger than this, and they're designed to take manure or unprocessed biogas from a variety of different CAFOs or a variety of different factory farms. And then the second type of project that I want to flag for everyone is the co-digestion model. So that's where an operator wants to take manure from factory farms, and they also want to take, for example, food processing wastewater. So I'll just say that onion processing, or maybe they want to take food waste from local grocery stores. So mixing together a different variety of waste streams into one digester facility to produce, to sort of maximize the biogas production potential. So I'm going to move through the next several slides pretty quickly. And so, please jot down questions if you want to dive into any of this a bit more, but I think it's helpful context. And again, I think a lot of this is going to be familiar to you all. So the main reasons that we're seeing for opposition, and the reasons that Food and Water Watch is so opposed to this development in this industry, is the entrenchment and expansion of factory farming. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. The environmental impacts, not just of encouraging and incentivizing the largest and worst factory farms, but also the environmental impacts directly and immediately caused from the production of these gases, both in terms of our energy system and climate change, but also in terms of water quality and public health and air quality that only come about because we're now producing gas from these waste streams. Third, it's a false climate solution. So this is not putting us on a path to a livable future or a livable climate. And so, this is often presented to decision makers, as I'm sure you're familiar with since you're lobbying, as a win-win-win, right? We're going to save the climate, we're going to make money for family farmers, and we're gonna, we're gonna, everyone's going to get rich in the process. And that just simply doesn't hold up to the facts. Once you dig into the science and you dig into the incorrect assumptions that are sort of built into that, it falls apart like a house of cards. And then last, just at lost opportunity costs, there's so much attention and money being put into this right now. And where we're at as a society and with the climate crisis and with our policies, really every dollar we spend on the wrong things is a dollar that didn't get spent on the right things. And that's what I mean by lost opportunity costs. And I can talk about that in a bit more detail with these bills, SB 725 and the low carbon fuel standard in other states. Essentially what's happened is solar, wind, and geothermal, these zero emission, like actual solutions to climate change, are vastly less incentivized than factory farm gas. So if you're a developer and you're just a capitalist and want to make money, you're going to be investing in factory farms, not a solar array or a wind field. Okay, so I have this slide and I bring this up just to emphasize that factory farm gas production, or a manure biogas, biomethane, fundamentally relies on the existence and the perpetuation of the factory farm model. So what you're seeing in front of you here, you don't have factory farm gas production without these types of facilities. And this is especially true once we start talking about these low carbon fuel programs. And that's because in order to participate and get the incentives and the market demand that these programs establish and create, you have to have a really polluting and damaging facility in place to quote unquote mitigate. So for example, if you're a pasture-based dairy operation, your potential to participate in one of these fuel programs is nil to very, very minimal, because you need to have lagoons, you need to have excessive amounts of manure that you can't responsibly manage as sort of your baseline to be a player. And so again, you just have to have this baseline cruel, environmentally unsustainable public health threat on the ground before these low carbon fuel programs are even on the table for you as an operator. And then just want to emphasize, because very oftentimes the climate conversation by the developers is paired with these as supposed solutions to nutrient management problems. And so we see this in a lot of places where the industry hasn't been able to avoid the conversation about water quality as well as it has in some other places. And so the industry has sort of accepted, yes, we have a nutrient management problem. And so, hey, you should pay us a bunch of money to build these biogas facilities so we can make money off biogas. And what they leave out is that these are not nutrient management tools. They really don't have much, if anything, to do with improving nutrient management outcomes. And in fact, the science shows us, USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service agrees that digesters exacerbate nutrient pollution risks from manure. And so stated very simply here on the slide, digesters do not address factory farm water pollution in particular, and if anything, exacerbate the risk posed. And then we also know that factory farm gas operations have the potential and likelihood of increasing harmful air emissions. And so one of the major ones of those is ammonia. And, if we have sort of scientist-minded folks in the audience, happy to try to answer some more questions at the end. I'm not a scientist. So I do my best here, but essentially the reason that you have these increased air emissions and the reason why water quality outcomes might be different when you have undigested manure going out onto the landscape versus what's called digestate, or the digested material after gas production, is that the chemistry changes in the waste stream. And what the chemistry changes to is a more environmentally hazardous waste stream. And so the process of pulling carbon out to produce the biogas leaves behind more hazardous versions of the same pollutants that we know are a problem, like nitrogen and phosphorus. And then, I'll come back to a few slides that go into this in a little bit more detail. Just, these digesters are not a path towards a livable climate. And that's the case for a lot of reasons. So one that we'll come back to with the lobbying that the lobbying that y'all are doing there are the perverse incentives that are built into many of these programs. And so we can drill into that, but essentially, the way this is set up right now and the way this is happening on the ground in California and really in states throughout the country, you and Michigan actually have projects, I believe, that are profiting off of California's program today, is that every incentive is geared towards producing more methane, and there's no disincentive to produce less methane. And so there are very concrete examples out there in the world that I could point you to, but in a nutshell, there are a lot of practices that you can implement on a CAFO that can increase or decrease your manure methane emissions. And what we see are operators take out those pieces of equipment that were previously reducing their overall methane emissions once they started producing biogas and participating in these credit trading programs and these pollution trading programs. And in other words, they made a decision to increase their climate pollution so that the next day they could say they're mitigating the climate pollution to profit off of it. So that's the perverse incentive. It's been described, if you want to just Google it, because this is a really helpful just sort of framework to think about it. It's been called the Cobra effect, after an incident in India where the British government tried to control cobra populations in certain Indian cities. So they created a bounty system. And at first it seemed really effective because all these folks were bringing in cobras for the bounty. It turned out folks were just raising cobras to bring in for the bounty. So perverse incentives are a huge problem here and really undermines whatever climate benefit we may be getting from these kinds of projects. And then there's uncertain efficacy. So these red dots you see on the screen here is an analysis of carbon mapper data, which is satellite data that's been collected for the past few years that Food and Water Watch's research team went through. And each of these red dots represent what the carbon mapper system calls a super emitter of methane. These are all facilities with state-funded and currently incentivized digesters at large dairy facilities, and yet they remain super emitters of methane. So whenever you hear folks talk about digesters' potential to reduce methane emissions, you have to understand that that is based on models. Almost no one has done real world modeling to actually ascertain what's happening. And when that science is done, all the studies I've read, they find much higher emission rates than what are assumed in the models. All to say, efficacy is really uncertain here for just purely from a methane mitigation perspective. We're still producing a dirty fuel. This remains a combustion fuel that releases CO2 into the environment. So this is not a clean fuel we're talking about. And I want to come back to that because the way clean fuel is defined in SB 275 is really problematic for this reason. It presumes a carbon intensity score denotes cleanliness, and that's simply not true. And then finally, it's used to justify continued fossil fuel use and extraction. And so this is a big one just on the climate front. The oil and gas industry understands very well that renewable natural gas is its ticket to business as usual and a few more decades of profiteering off of the environment and public health. And so I'm going to have a little arrow pop up here. This was a leaked slide from a natural gas sort of insider presentation from a few years ago that E&E News published. And this middle bullet says, renewable natural gas is coming, likely will save the natural gas business. And so I'm going to explain why they would feel that way. They feel that way because of factory farm gas. There's a company called Dominion Energy that has a partnership with Smithfield Foods. And Dominion Energy is a natural gas provider and pipeline operator. And Dominion Energy, their position is that if they can get 4% factory farm gas from Smithfield pig factory farms, their entire operation is carbon neutral. So 96% fracked natural gas running through their pipelines, 4% Smithfield factory farm gas. And their position is, and if it's 5%, they're not only 5% factory farm gas, they're not climate neutral, they're climate negative. They're acting as a sink in the environment for the climate. So that sort of figure gives you an understanding of why the oil and gas industry would be so excited about this. And so now we're seeing these burgeoning markets for factory farm gas. And so the starting point here from an economics perspective is that The fuel is not the product here. Okay, so the fuel is very expensive. I think the last time I saw a figure run about this, it was 6 times more expensive to be using factory farm biomethane than fossil natural gas. So I'm not advocating that we stay on fossil natural gas, but it's just a very expensive fuel because of how expensive it is to process. Digesters are very expensive to build, and they're expensive to maintain. And so the reason that we're even having this conversation is because of really significant public subsidies through these pollution trading programs, and then through direct grants, and then through enormous tax credits coming down through the Inflation Reduction Act. So the economics here are not about a fuel product, they're about environmental credit trading. And so where's this money? All right, I'm going to spend some time here on this credit trading because y'all had a few questions about this that I want to make sure that we kind of dig into. Okay, so when I say credit trading, I'm talking about SB 275-like programs. So SB 275 is very much what we call an LCFS copycat bill, because we're seeing this type of legislation pop up in a lot of different states. And California was the first state to implement a program like this. They came up with the name Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Other states have operational programs like Oregon's Clean Fuels Program and several others. And essentially what a program like this does is it creates a pollution trading market. And so some of you may be familiar with cap and trade programs. So it's similar to that, but it's actually different, and I would argue even less effective in terms of actually being a climate mitigation tool. So on one side of the accounting books essentially are the fossil fuel producers. So let's just say what BPs of the world, Shells of the world, Chevrons of the world. They're producing fuels that have a carbon intensity value, or just a number that represents the overall footprint of that fuel for the climate. That number is above whatever the low carbon fuel standard, whatever the LCFS sets as the benchmark. So all of those are creating deficits. So those companies either have to produce different fuels that have less climate impact, or they need to purchase credits. And that takes us to the other side of the accounting book. And those are the credit generators. And so this in California and in all the other programs, there's a variety of different credit generators, but essentially anyone producing a fuel that comes in with a carbon intensity below that program benchmark is eligible to produce these credits, which can then be sold. So the basic premise of these programs is find pollution reduction in one place that is then sold to the oil and gas industry to meet state compliance obligations. In other words, purchasing a credit in a practical sense means an oil and gas company or some producer or provider of a high carbon intensity fuel is polluting more than they would otherwise be allowed to under law, but for buying the credits, if that makes sense. And that's sort of the basic premise of how it works. Now, where this really falls apart from our perspective and really becomes a very broken offset mechanism. And I don't really need to get into the details of that, but I mean, from a technical perspective, I think these low carbon fuel standards are distinguishable from offset programs. And one of the ways that matters is these low carbon fuel standard programs don't contain the same safeguards that we usually see in offset programs. So for example, the California low carbon fuel standard does not require compliance with local laws and regulations to protect the environment. California's cap and trade program does. And so there's just sort of a less rigorous oversight culture around these low carbon fuel standards than there is with cap and trade. Either way, they're not really moving us to where we need to be. And the fundamental problem is that factory farms are treated as far and away the best climate mitigating facilities anywhere on planet Earth by a really significant margin. And that's because the way these programs and the way that SB 275 is written, I can essentially guarantee you this would be the outcome in Michigan. Factory farms, they're the baseline by which that carbon intensity score would be calculated. In other words, how many credits they could generate as a participant in a program like this in other words, how lucrative it would be for them, is assumes the most egregious climate criminal factory farm possible. So no matter how egregious the current operation is in terms of climate emissions, that is accepted as the baseline. And then anything that reduces us from that baseline is lavishly rewarded. So this goes back to the perverse incentives that I was talking about. An operator has every reason to be the worst actor possible, because once you get into a program like this, had you made a choice anywhere along the way to be more sustainable or to reduce your climate footprint, you would be making less money from this program compared to your competitor who decided to just be the worst actor possible, and now they're going to get the biggest payout of all the different players who might participate. So these credit trading programs have a whole lot of problems with them. Would really, enjoy to talk more about the program that you're trying to oppose. I could flag some of the other things that stood out to me as really problematic, but that is the California program in particular is the primary driver of factory farm gas build out today across the United States. So the next biggest driver of sort of where this money is coming from are tax credits and tax benefits. The biggest one right now is the Inflation Reduction Act. And essentially the way the IRA works for our purposes here today is it creates tax credits that if you go out and you produce some sort of clean energy, you're eligible to get these tax credits. And then those tax credits are sellable. So it almost creates like a sellable type of market situation, but essentially they're all just tax credits. And they've done that for a variety of different types of fuels like hydrogen and others. There's actually a public comment period open right now under what's called Section 45Y of the Inflation Reduction Act with respect to clean electricity production. So one of the things we're seeing in California, and one of the things we're going to start seeing a lot more, is burning factory farm gas on site in an internal combustion engine to produce electricity, on the theory that that electricity is then used to power electric vehicles, as opposed to powering electric vehicles with solar, wind, or other zero emission sources. The comment period that's open right now will be the space in which the federal government decides if that type of project, what I just described, will be eligible for this massively beneficial tax credit. And all of those are based entirely on what I said before about the carbon intensity value. Everything hinges on carbon intensity. And so again, when you see clean hydrogen in a federal program that EPA is proposing or running out, you need to be really wary, because it's probably very narrowly considering carbon intensity. So you could have a fuel that unambiguously poisons local communities. If it's got the right climate intensity score, carbon intensity score, it's going to be called clean under the way these laws are written. And it would be called clean under the way that SB 275 is written. And then we have direct subsidies, and I'll wrap up pretty soon here. Direct subsidies, some of you are probably really familiar with these. These aren't unique to biogas. EQIP, for example, FSA, just fund factory farm operations in a variety of ways. AgStar is federal EPA's sort of digester promotion program, and there are others. And then at the very bottom of my list here, I included marketable fuel. So, same point at the top. The fuel is not really the product here. That these operators are making some money off that, but they're quite open about it. Their business model all lives under bullet one here. Their business model is, we will make profit off of pollution trading through California's low carbon fuel standard. And in the meantime, we're all going to lobby like heck to get every state in the union to pass a similar law so we can maximize and stack all these different incentives. So, I did want to highlight Food and Water Watch, and I'm not even going to try to do it on the fly here, but after I stop sharing, I can share a link. Food and Water Watch published a report earlier this year titled "The Big Oil and Big Ag Ponzi Scheme: Factory Farm Biogas," and it really, the reason we did this deep dive into the data and the economics between the oil and gas industry and this factory farm gas industry was to highlight sort of the boondoggle that we're being presented with here. And I think it raises the really important question that has a pretty obvious answer once you start getting into the research of why would the oil and gas industry be so excited about factory farm gas? And I've sort of talked about that a little bit before. But we're seeing, hundreds and hundreds of digesters get funded by Chevron, BP, Shell, and others. And we've seen those investments really, really dramatically increase. So we were seeing, over the span of a couple of years, the data was showing, $1 to $2 billion in acquisition investments by some of these really big oil and gas companies. And then in 2022, it spiked to over $6 billion in acquisition spent just that year on renewable natural gas companies. And these low carbon fuel programs and those federal incentives we just talked about are really driving the feeding frenzy. If you and I really want to emphasize here, if you're Chevron, I don't want to claim to know exactly what Chevron is doing. So I'll say it this way. If I were Chevron, I would be out there scouring rural America for the largest, most polluting factory farms to partner with. And I'd be encouraging them to keep it up. Because every gram of climate pollution they produce is a gram of climate pollution I can buy on the cheap and say I'm a good climate actor over here. Right. And so that is the system that has been put into place here. And we're marrying two very dangerous industries through these programs. Okay, great. This slide doesn't seem terribly appropriate for us. So, this is my last slide. These are just different ways that Food and Water Watch has used our legal advocacy and organizing to push back on specific projects and then sort of on these higher level systemic issues we've talked about. So zoning is a huge one for most of these types of projects. Environmental permitting is very lax right now. And I guess I should emphasize for Michigan there, because you all have, very serious water quality concerns. One of the problems that we're seeing and that experts are starting to raise the alarm about is the treatment of these digester wastes as though they're the same as what came off of a farm. In other words, you've got a dairy that's sending manure to one of these community digesters that I described. And then that digester produces the gas and it sends back digestate to the dairy. And then the dairy just puts it onto fields under the exact same plan or with the exact same process that they would have absent any of the digester stuff in the middle. And that is scientifically indefensible and is just, from a regulatory perspective, absurd. And so that's one of the major concerns. And we're just not seeing regulators get it, right? That this is heavy industry. We're moving even further away from anything that could reasonably be called agriculture. And then so just restricting taxpayer and ratepayer support. We haven't talked about it a bunch here, but I know that the Michigan Public Service Commission has been looking into this. So this is another place where these industries are getting a lot of money, is through the state utility boards, who are requiring the state IOUs to buy biomethane, or requiring ratepayers to pay for the pipelines or the infrastructure that might be needed to get this biogas online. Right. So these PSUs and the PSC there has a really big role to play in these early stages of this industry's rollout. So I'd really encourage you to pay attention to the PSC. I think I'm sorry if I'm getting the name wrong. Like every state's name is like a different combination of the same three words. So I think it's the Public Service Commission. Put out a report, what was it, in 2022? It was like a renewable natural gas feasibility study, essentially. And if my memory is correct, had the horrifying example of this supposedly great future where people are driving their electric vehicles up to their local dairy and plugging into the pump, the EV charger that's being fueled from the manure in the lagoon next door. Anyway, it was dystopic for me. So that's a really important place to look. And then lastly, just greenwashing. I mean, this has really become a centerpiece of both the factory farm industry's greenwashing and the oil and gas industry's greenwashing. And so on top of all these other problems, I think one of the, greenwashing is just offensive on an individual level. I think on a societal level, it distracts us and really sort of hampers our ability to move towards solutions as a community. And so, when so many people just are lied to in terms of these companies' climate impacts and their, what sort of genuine actions they may or may not be taking, I think it's a real problem.